It's about time to get started, so we'll go ahead, if you got your Bibles, open those up to Hebrews 12, and we're going to pick up in the middle of a discussion. It's always hard to find a spot to start. So he's been talking about, in chapter 10, about the response that we have. There are these things that you do. He's going to say, so let us do these things. And one of the reasons why he words things that way is because he thinks that the people he's talking to are those who are of faith and do not shrink back to the destruction of their souls. In other words, they keep going forward. And then he's going to give you a list of people who did that. It doesn't always look like we think. We tend to think of the faithful one as being the mighty warrior who goes out and slays the giant and leads the army and does all of those things. And sometimes it does look like that, but it doesn't always. Sometimes faith looks like nurses or midwives who refuse to do what a king asks them. It looks like a woman who chooses God over her country and her culture. Sometimes it looks like a woman who slays a general in a tent with a peg. Sometimes it looks like a hairy man who does all sorts of weird things and then shaves his head. Sometimes it looks like all the things that you see. Sometimes it looks like really, really, really bad choices. A bad choice can be made in faith. And for a long time I wrestled with that. I was like, how can you do the wrong thing but do it faithfully? Abraham and Sarah. I think that they did the wrong thing faithfully. They knew there was supposed to be a child. They could only think of one way that children come, and so they tried to put things into practice to bring about the child of promise. Or really, not necessarily the best way to do things, but that's the way they did them, because they understood that God had made a promise, and they were going to try and live that out the best way they could. So that's what you get in chapter 11. You get these highlights of the Hebrew people throughout the history of their culture, and faith is at the center of each one of those things. Sometimes it's more difficult to see than others, but that is the point. That these people are not perfect, they're faithful. And so then you get to chapter 12, and he's going to say, therefore, since we are surrounded by this great cloud of witnesses, let us do the same thing that they did. Let us lay aside the things that weigh us down. Let us weigh aside the things that keep us from being who God wants us to be. And this is essentially what Jesus means when Jesus talks about cutting your hand off and plucking your eye out. Right? He just uses a little bit more hyperbolic language there. Right, this is more of a metaphor. Jesus, anyway, lots of figures. If something is causing you to not be who you should be, get rid of it. That's sort of the idea here. Laying aside the weights, the things that are holding you down, the thoughts that keep you back, whatever it might be, lay that aside. Get rid of the things, the sins, the shortcomings. Sin doesn't always appear to be wicked. Right? If sin always appeared wicked, people wouldn't do it. Because if you ask the average person, are you a good person? What is the answer? Yes. Yeah, and things that are overtly wicked, that carry with it some heinous cultural understanding, like piracy, most people would not sign up to be a pirate. I mean, we've kind of like Disney-ified piracy, but it's not a good thing, right? You pillage, you kill, you murder, you do all of those things. If you ask the average person, do you want to be a pirate? Most people would say no. That's not a good thing. And so if sin always looked wicked, if it always looked like being a pirate, then almost nobody would do it. But sin doesn't just look that way. It also looks enticing. It looks beautiful. It looks good. When Satan tried to get Adam and Eve to eat the apple, he didn't cloak it in a shroud of wickedness. He clothed it in a shroud of beauty. Look at this good thing you'll be doing. You'll get to be like God. You'll get to do all of these things. You'll have self-actualization. He didn't use those words, probably because they wouldn't have understood them. But were he talking today, that might be one of the things that he said. Now, that's not in and of itself a bad thing, but this idea of focusing on me and what I want, that's sort of where things go. And so stop doing that and run the race with endurance. It's a marathon, not a sprint. A real marathon, like hundreds of miles long, not just 26.2. Run the race with endurance. Look to Jesus. the one who starts and ends our faith. And he did this because he had joy set before him. And then we're going to pick up in verse 3, where it talks about considering the hostility that Jesus endured. So then we should expect the same kind of hostility. Now, that doesn't always look like government persecution. That's sort of what Jesus faced. You could call it government persecution. The leaders of his country actively working against him. It doesn't always look like that. What are some ways that you, as a believer in the United States today, might suffer hostility? What kinds of hostility might you have to endure? Yeah. So sometimes there's just the general distaste for Christianity. Some people just don't like it, and if you talk about it, they try to make you feel bad for what you believe and who you are. Yeah. Yeah, you're ridiculed for not compromising, for not lining up with whoever, whatever idea somebody has. One of the ways that you sort of try and force conformity is ridicule. And we have to be careful that we don't do that to other people. Because you'll see the tactics that Satan uses or that people use to try and make you feel bad for being a believer, and we have to be careful that we don't do that to each other. One of my least favorite things that has happened in the history of religion in our country are debates. Have you ever read them? They're terrible. Right now, I say that with the caveat that there's a lot of good information in them, but you have to filter a lot to get to the good information. Because the point of the debate was to make the other person look silly, to win, right? To be victorious over them. It wasn't to explain your position well. It wasn't to convince them. It wasn't to help them see a better way, right? Because if it was, the conversations would be different. There's name calling, there's ridiculing, there's belittling. There's all of these things that happen. And we wonder why people get into fights. Right? We wonder why people might leave, come into the debate as acquaintances and they leave as enemies. Well, if you treated me the way that most debaters treated each other in the past, and certainly not all, but most, I would never want to be your friend. And so we have to be careful when we talk about, well, how do we endure hostility? This is sort of the idea when Paul says, as far as you are concerned, be at peace with all people. Don't do these things. Right? That's sort of the other side of the picture, is if this is what hostility sinners heap upon those who are disciples of Jesus, then certainly we as disciples of Jesus should not be heaping hostility upon one another. So, yes, ridiculing, calling you silly for your belief. Yes. Yeah, and when you look at the Gospels, the hostility against Jesus came from whom? The religious people, right? The religious people, and so we have to be we have to be careful. It's sort of like the love your enemies, the thing that Jesus says. And when we think about loving our enemies, we think of the guy across the street who kicked my dog, or the person at work who's tried to get me fired a few times. We think of those people, but then we turn around and we don't apply it to family. We don't apply it to my brother or sister who has a different opinion about something. And so we do have to be careful that we don't become the source of hostility that other people have to endure. We'll do Bob, and then we'll come over here. Yeah. 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 People get angry. I saw other hands. Yes. Yes. And yeah, we have to be, when there is hostility, and there will be. Uh, I don't want to ever put across the idea that if you do these three steps, that everybody will love you and there will be peace. No, no, no. But when there is hostility, where there is fighting, where there is disagreement, we as disciples of Jesus must be the voice of peace and reason. We have to be the one who says, you know what, there's some disagreement here, but I'm not going to get mad with you because we disagree. I want to hear what you have to say. I want to try and understand where you're coming from, what you believe, why you believe it, and then I want to have a conversation with you from a shared point, from a shared understanding, so that we can move forward together. And some people aren't going to want to do that. And that's sort of where you get the picture. If people don't want to hear, you just shake the dust off your sandals and you move along. It's always interesting that it never says if people don't want to hear you, throw rocks at them and kick their dog and make sure that their food tastes terrible. It never says be mean to people. It says if they don't want to listen, fine, move on and talk to somebody else. But as far as we're concerned, we should not be, me as an individual, I should never be the source of hostility against someone else. That is the opposite of what I am supposed to be. Because the only thing that happens if I get mad or if I yell at you or if I treat you poorly is, first, it just galvanizes your position. Right? You just sort of like dig your heels in. And then you're going to see me as somebody who is unreasonable, and you're never going to want to talk with me about it again. Right? Facebook should be a perfect example of how this works. Right? Somebody says something on Facebook, somebody says something really nasty to them, and it goes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and they block each other, and now they're never friends again. But would they have ever said that? Would that conversation have happened that way if they were in person? I don't know, maybe. Sometimes, yeah, sometimes it will. But once you do that, right? If somebody says really something really mean to you on Facebook, there's this cool thing they invented a few years ago. It's on your mouse. It's a scroll wheel, right? And you can just push that up or down if you're using a Mac. I think the Mac is down. It doesn't. You can change the settings on that. Anyway, however you want to move it, just move that, and that mean comment will go off the page, and you don't have to read it anymore. Yes, yes. Blessed are the peacemakers because they are the sons of God. Yeah. Yes. And that sort of comes back maybe to Julie's comment a little bit too. Is I remember, and I'm not even going to tell you the candidate's name. It doesn't matter. But I remember the first time I was sitting in a pew, and I heard somebody say they're visiting preacher, and I heard them say that if you vote for such and such a candidate, then you're not even a Christian. And I remember thinking, wait a minute, I'm not sure that that's in the Bible. And so what we do is we start taking our opinions and we start doing that. It's the technical word for it is syncretism. And what it means is you combine two things that don't belong together. Right? The politics of the United States and Christianity. Now, there might be principles that some people years ago derived from Christianity itself, and they used that to create documents that govern the country. There might be plans for God of raising up and tearing down nations, right? And so in those very loose ways, they're connected, but there is not a I mean, at least as far as I have read, there is not a political party that is connected to the New Testament church. And we have to be very careful that we don't do that thing called syncretism, where you start linking together things that don't belong together. And I try very hard. I know I fail sometimes. I try to keep those things disconnected. So I promise that as long as I'm preaching here, I will never tell you from the pulpit who to vote for, unless I happen to be running for office. And right, I promise. I do. I do run every year. Uh, yes, that's my platform. I got I got about 17 votes in Wisconsin this year. It was amazing. uh, so we have to be careful. We have to be careful that we keep things in their place. If you want to be involved in politics, can you be a Christian who is also involved in politics? Absolutely. Absolutely. Just like you can be a sports fan and be no, I'm not sure if you can do that. But I mean, you can be a sports fan and be a Christian, right? You just have to keep those things separated. If he were a sports fan, I'm sure that God would root for the Bears, but it's not in the Bible, right? It's not there. And so we have to keep those things disconnected. Not as far as how you live your life while you're being a sports fan, but you have to make sure that you don't make bad connections. Mhm. Yes. Yes. And when we do that, right, when truth enters into the equation, kind of going back to something that was said earlier, one of the reactions you should expect is anger. Right? When you tell somebody, or when the way that you live demonstrates that something is wrong, you should expect hostility. And really, that is the reason for much of the hostility that Jesus faced. How many traditions were there that surrounded the Sabbath? I mean, if you go and you read all of the text in Scripture that is about the Sabbath, there's really not a whole lot said. I mean, there's a little, but not a lot. Now, if you go back and you look at all of the rabbinical writings concerning the Sabbath and all of the rules that they had created surrounding the Sabbath, you would think that most of the Old Testament is about the Sabbath. I mean, to the point where they have all these things that you can and can't do. And so when Jesus comes along and Jesus starts doing the things they say that you can't do, sometimes it's almost like he's blatantly doing it that way. I mean, I'm sure that I don't claim to know his thoughts while he's doing it. But did you know that one of the things you weren't allowed to do was to make mud from spittle on the Sabbath? So then one day when Jesus is healing somebody, what does he do? He spits in the dirt and makes mud and wipes it on the person's eyes. So if you knew all of these rules, you're like, I can't believe he's doing this. What in the world is wrong with this guy? And they get mad. They get angry. The reason why they want to kill him is not because he violates some commandment that God has given them. It's because he violates their traditional understanding of what Sabbath observance looks like. And so when you come into a situation and you bring truth, even to people who claim to want to know that truth, and it goes against what they have always believed or always heard or the conclusions that they have come to themselves, you should expect one of the reactions is hostility. And one of the reasons why is because you're taking away the undergirding. That which supports somebody's entire world, you are shaking the foundation of it. And when people don't know what is right or wrong anymore, they get mad. I mean, think about in your life when something has happened, something earth-shaking, some new truth that you have learned. And one of the emotions, fear is one of them, anger is another, and you begin to lash out. Yeah, it is a defense mechanism. And so as a believer, somebody who is supposed to be a light shining in the darkness, I should expect the darkness to get angry from time to time. I should expect that because that's what Jesus had to endure. And all Jesus wanted to do was good, and it made people angry. And so then if I am standing in my culture as this light in the darkness, imperfect, right? Not at all perfect like Christ was, but attempting to be like him, I should expect hostility too. And when it happens, the reaction of the disciples in Acts chapter 4 and 5 is amazing. In Acts chapter 4, they get brought before the ruling council. It would be like if the governor of Tennessee called you up and said, hey, I hear you're a religious person. I want you to stop that. I don't think that he would. I'm just saying that's what it would be like. And how would you react? What would you do? Well, you go out and you keep doing it. And then the next day, he arrests you again. And he brings you before the Supreme Court. And he's like, hey, I thought we told you to stop doing this. And you're like, yeah, I know you did, but I'm just going to keep doing it. And then they throw you in jail. How many of you would rejoice that you were in jail? Or would you be angry and throw a fit and want to start a GoFundMe to sue the governor? The reaction of the disciples when they were brought before the Sanhedrin and beaten for what they believe was to rejoice. In fact, they prayed to God and they thanked God that they had been beaten because they were counted worthy of suffering for the name. And that should be my reaction. If I am standing on truth and occasionally the darkness gets mad, that means I'm doing something right. The Apostle Paul wrote to Timothy and said, all who desire to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution. Not because you're out actively looking for it, but because every once in a while, and maybe more often depending on your situation, people get mad. It's a defense mechanism. And when you show somebody something new, they get angry. And you think, oh, well, I mean, that's not universally true. It kind of is. In ancient Greece, there was this guy named Pythagoras, and he developed this thing. You may have used it before, the Pythagorean theorem, and you have all these beautiful ways to figure out the sides of triangles as long as it's a right triangle. And then somebody came along and suggested that not all numbers are squares. And there's this thing called irrational numbers. Now, I don't know if they called it irrational numbers at the time, but you can divide something by something, and it just keeps going forever. Do you know that so shook the world of the mathematicians in ancient Greece that they killed people over that? They tied rocks around their feet and threw them off bridges. I mean, like real mafia stuff. Because you had the audacity to suggest that numbers could not be divided. Well, I mean, you can, but you're just going to be doing it forever. And that's math. Math. If mathematicians are killing each other over division, seems to be a universal thing. Yes. It does. Yes. One of my favorite examples of that, of being a believer and being right and becoming hostile to somebody who has a different idea, is one of the names for Santa Claus is Saint Nick, right? And that he's actually named after a real person. Right? There's a guy who was alive in the 4th century. His name is Nicholas of Patara, and he was at this thing called the Council of Nicaea. And one of the big things that they discussed at the Council of Nicaea was the divinity of Jesus. Is Jesus divine? We should, yes. Yes, yes. How could you show me in the Bible that Jesus is divine? Yeah, God claims him as his son. Right, the Holy Spirit declared him to be the Son of God with power at his resurrection. Right, there are lots of places you could go to show that Jesus is divine. You can go to the fulfilled prophecies over in Isaiah where it says that he will be called Eternal Father, Mighty God. You tend not to call people God who aren't God. Right? I mean, you just don't do that, right? Well, Saint Nick, Nicholas of Patara, they had this discussion at the Council of Nicaea, and there was a man there by the name of Arius who claimed that Jesus wasn't divine. He was almost divine. He was sort of like God, but not quite equal to the Father. And they got into a discussion, and guess what Nicholas of Patara did to help end the debate? He punched him. He punched him, right? And so is Nicholas right? Yes, he's right. He didn't handle that well. Unless sometimes you just have to slap a heretic, right? I don't know that that was an acceptable way to handle that, but we have to be careful that it makes Santa Claus a little bit scarier when you anyway, we have to be careful that we don't react that way to an idea that is different from what I have heard, from what you have heard, because we're supposed to be those who seek the truth. And if something is true, then you don't have to be afraid of it. If something in areas of opinion, you don't have to agree. And that's okay. And so we do have to make sure that we aren't the source of hostility. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yes. And I remember thinking for a little while. We can talk more about that idea later. That's a really good discussion, but we've got to focus. We're going to run out of time to talk about Hebrews. Absolutely. Yeah. Yes. Even if we have the truth and we don't present it in love and with love, then we're wrong. And that's sort of the idea, is that we should expect to suffer hostility, not to be hostile. We present the truth in love, and if somebody doesn't want to hear it, you don't have to force it on them. You can go to the next person, and you just keep doing that. And he's going to bring this up, thinking about people like Jesus, thinking about people like Isaiah, who is the one put in the log and sawn in twain. All of these things that you see in Hebrews chapter 11 where people are suffering, he's going to say, but in your struggle against sin, you haven't resisted to the point of bloodshed yet. And so that is very humbling to think of the times where I feel like I have suffered because of my faith. Never yet have I really have I been through what some of the people in chapter 11 have been through. And I hope that that's never the case. Right? I hope that none of you ever have to be listed in a list like that. But it could be. And we have to be willing to do that. And if there is anything that I'm not willing to give up for Jesus, then I really have to question my devotion to Jesus. Right? And he puts that on the table, right? That's not a trick. He doesn't ask you to follow him and then bring that up later, like, oh, you didn't realize. I mean, he puts that on the table. If you love father, mother, brother, sister, whoever more than me, then you're not worthy of me. If you want to put your hand to the plow and then look back, you're not worthy. Right? I mean, he lets you know that what he is asking for, what he expects, what he desires is complete devotion. And that's sort of the point that he's making here is you have struggled a little bit, but you haven't done what we've talked about earlier. And I don't think he's saying that to shame them. It's to encourage them. Like, look at what faith did in the lives of these people. You have the same faith, so you can do the same thing. You can stand in the face of adversity. You can stand in the midst of what you're enduring, because it can get worse. And so it's meant to encourage them. And then he brings up the idea in verse 5, down through a little while down through about verse 11, this idea of sometimes children being disciplined. I don't think the argument he's making is that everything bad that happens to you is because God is disciplining you. I don't think that's what he's saying. There are other spiritual actors. Satan is active in the world. There are demons that are active in the world, as well as angels and God and the Spirit. And so there are all these actors. Job and his friends, when bad things happened to Job, who did they think did it? God. Yeah, God did. God did this. Why did God do this to me? That's Job's question throughout the book. And he even says, if God would just show up, I'd correct him. I would show him why he was wrong to do these things to me. And when God shows up at the end, he sort of introduces himself by, who is this that darkens wisdom without counsel? Oh. He just that very sobering moment. Job's response to God asking questions, where were you when I made this? And where were you when I did this? And where were you when I did this? Can you do the mighty things that God can do? At the end, Job just says, I repent in dust and ashes, and I cover my mouth. I was wrong. And as far as we know, in the book, God never explains to Job what happened. He just says, who are you to ask? That's a sobering thought. And when it comes to the things that happen in life, sometimes Satan does things. Sometimes people do things. Right? People do bad things. And sometimes people do bad things all by themselves. Right? God did not make them do that. Satan didn't make them do that. Sometimes people just are nasty and they steal things, or they hurt others. Sometimes people just do bad stuff. Sometimes there are those supernatural actors, and when they are, or when there are, I don't know how to know unless it is revealed to you. Unless there is something that makes it known. And so I hesitate to say that every bad thing that happens in the life of a believer is discipline from God. I don't think that you should say that. But sometimes there is discipline from God. And it seems to be that this discipline from the Lord shows up when we're just not being who we ought to be. If you ever raised a toddler, they fall down a lot, don't they? Yeah, that's why we call them toddlers. Sometimes they hurt themselves, and you didn't do it. Right? Sometimes you have to suggest forcefully that they not touch the VCR. Right? And so sometimes there is discomfort that is brought into the toddler's life, and the parent is the direct cause of it. Other times the toddler hurts themselves, and it's not anybody's fault. They just fell over because they're 2 or 3. And that is sort of the idea here, is that there will be times where something bad happens, and bad stuff just happens. Other times bad things happen, and it's because you were touching the VCR. And you shouldn't have been. And so a healthy way to think about this is that sometimes bad things happen, and sometimes I'm going to be disciplined for what I do. So whether it's just one of those bad things, or whether it's discipline from God, how can I use what is happening to become a better believer? Yeah, that's a great point. Transfer? I like that. Yeah, you learn something in one place and you transfer it to another. Yes. Have you ever had, so the idea of practicing and honing and reinforcing beliefs and behaviors, have you ever taken a child into a new situation for the very first time? How do they normally behave? I mean, you don't know. Yeah, erratically. Yeah, you don't know. And one of the things that happens with kids is, how often are we in services on Sundays? What, like once a week, right? Just on Sundays. And so one of the things that we have found, it was suggested to us, is that you have to practice that before Sunday happens. So you have to take the kids and you have to sit down, and you have to have sit still and be quiet practice. And you practice sitting still and being quiet. You practice, opening songbooks, and you practice singing, and you practice praying, so that they kind of go through and they know that, hey, this is how that works. This is how I turn to the page. I find the number. This is how I pray. I put my hands together. Deborah does this. Like, you can put your hand, and we're working on it. There's not a right way to do that. It's just interesting to see the different things. Put your hands together like this, and she goes. But you just practice. And then when Sunday comes, and it's like, all right, it's time to sit still and be quiet. They know, aha, I've practiced. And so then they can sit still and maybe be more quiet than they would have been without the discipline. And so that sort of is the idea, that divine discipline it's more than just punishment. It's not God waiting in the sky to smite you. It is God helping us become who we ought to be. It's training. And that might be a better way to think about the purpose of discipline is training us so that we can be who we ought to be. And that's the idea here. When you go through here, there's this idea of correction and discipline. There's this idea of training and discipline so that when you are put to the test, you pass. And that's the idea. Any other thoughts there in that section? What do you think is the peaceful fruit of righteousness? Yeah. It's this idea of becoming who you ought to be. The fruit of the Spirit, all those things that you see there, you don't become those things without practice and training. I mean, you don't go to bed an unbeliever one day and wake up the next and exhibiting all the fruits of this, all the fruit of the Spirit in perfection. It takes training, it takes diligence, and that's the idea that we are learning to share in the holiness of Christ, of God. We are becoming like Him, and we go through this process of training and discipline, and it yields in us the peaceful fruit of righteousness by those who have been trained by it. And one of the amazing things about Christianity is the peace that it yields in the lives of believers. The world is chaotic, and people want peace. Right? They want to know that everything is going to be okay. They want to know that they are going to be taken care of. They want to know. And so in the news, you have the turmoil over in Eastern Europe, Western Asia, over in the Ukraine. And everybody in the world is focused on that because we don't like conflict generally. We want there to be peace. I want to know that I'm going to be okay. I want to know that everything is going to turn out the way that it's supposed to. And the only thing that I know that really offers that is God. And so in Christianity, you have something that you can't get anywhere else, and it is the peace that passes understanding. Peace with God, knowing that in the end, everything is going to be okay. And it takes discipline in order to learn to trust that, in order to believe that. And that is going to be the place from which he will then encourage them through the rest of the letter. And that will start in verse 12, which is where we'll begin next week. Thank you so much for your attention. We're going to have to cover a lot of ground next week, but we can do it. We might spend some time in the second half. We're going to spend time at the festal gathering. So that's a hint for what's coming. Start in chapter 12, verse 12. Thank you for your attention and comments.